Hey folks, it's Presley. So I mentioned that today we would be doing a flip lesson on kind of just trying to wrap up these Unit 3 notes, although I don't think we'll quite do it today, but we're going to knock it down. All right, so we left off talking about Louis and Versailles and consolidating power in France. Something kind of similar is going to happen in Russia. Traditionally, the Russian hierarchy had the boyars, which were kind of the old aristocracy who were second only to the prince. So think like dukes, these people who have this like kind of crazy amount of power. Really, the only people who are more powerful than them are the royal family. You have a merchant class, and then you have what we call the Russian serfs. These were almost lower than peasants because they're free labor. They don't get to leave the cities. They're kept under control. They carry the highest tax burden. So what happens is a lot of people who were peasants who might have been able to avoid serfdom, because serfdom's like one step below peasant class, many of them were forced into serfdom out of financial inability to pay the taxes. So Ivan comes along. He confiscates the land from his boyars and his opponents who were boyars, and forces them and their families to move to Moscow. This is very similar to what Louis did in France with Versailles. He uses the I can never pronounce this word correctly, oprichnina, to act like state police. These people were crazy. If you remember, oh gosh, we watched that little bit of Fievel and the American Tale, and kind of this scariness that happens as they kind of like take over and show up. The role of this group is to be basically to beat the boyars into submission. They're brutal, and they're his tool against the boyars. Oh my gosh, I'm losing my mind. Halloween. So not too long after Ivan, I believe it's his grandson, is Peter the Great. Peter the Great is usually most recognizable. He's 6'9" at a time when the average man is about 5'8". So he's a giant of a man. So even though he tries to go around Europe incognito, you're going to notice the 7-foot tall man in the room, especially when most people are not even are a foot shorter than that. If you imagine if a major basketball star came walking through the room, I mean, you'd know because he would be giant. Well, same thing with Peter. So there were three main groups trying to get into, kind of get power, and the church, the czar, and the boyars. Peter is going to use this opportunity to make sure that he is the one who's in power. First, he gets rid of his sister to gain the title of czar himself. And guys, by the way, sometimes you see czar spelled with a T, and sometimes it's spelled with a C. It's a translation thing. Don't worry about it. They mean the same thing. He forces her into a convent. Then he gets rid of the position of patriarch, which is like the equivalent of, well, not really the equivalent, but semi-like the equivalent of pope in the Roman Catholic Church. Patriarch is the head of the Orthodox Church. So what he does is he incorporates that role into government by creating the Holy Synod, which is him at the head of it. So he makes sure he's the one in power. Peter the Great wants to reform Russia. He's very fond of the way Europe's doing things. He knows that Russia's kind of behind. So in order to do this, he sees that, hey, we need to industrialize. So he tries things like promoting people according to merit rather than social class. He reorganizes the government into provinces. It works, kind of. The problem is you can't industrialize if you don't have the resources to industrialize. And so he's trying to force it, and it doesn't work so well. In fact, what it does is it kind of cuts the power of the upper class, but then the peasants get even further into debt, and more serfdom's happening because the taxes are higher and they can't pay it. Peter's going to get what we call a window on a warm water seaport. He's going to go to war, and he's going to gain access to a warm water seaport, which is going to be helpful with trade. Because, if it ices over all the time, then you can't do business. When he does this, he gains some new land, and he decides he's going to, in this western portion of Russia, build a new winter palace. Looks kind of familiar. Looks an awful lot like Versailles. He purposely does this. So he moves the capital to this western area, which is named St. Petersburg, and everything's designed in a Western style. He is going to be so fond of the Westernness that, Russia, because of trade relations, oftentimes resembled more of the Mongolian, Asian, Chinese kind of Ottoman look in dress and architecture, the way people wore beards and things. All of this was very kind of Eastern. Peter wants them to communicate with the West, so he forces people to get rid of beards. In fact, if you came anywhere near him with the beard, he was known to stick his fingers in it and rip it out by the roots. I can imagine. I don't have a beard, but I would imagine that would be rather painful. He creates a state newspaper. He's going to force this industrialization. He does a lot of really good things, or at least tries them, which is why he's called the Great. And we'll talk about Catherine here coming up. So shifting gears a little bit, centralizing control for the Ottomans. There is going to be a group of young boys who are essentially enslaved, or, well, enslaved is probably the best way to say it. They're given over to the Ottoman government as tribute owed after conquest, and they're young Christian boys. This is because Islamic law prohibited the enslavement of Muslims and Jews. They were called peoples of the book. Christians were not part of that group, so they could work as getting this tribute system. Some of them became elite soldiers called the Janissaries. It's an elite group in the Ottoman army. They're fiercely loyal to the Sultan. There's a lot of prestige in being one of the Janissaries. There's a picture of one there for you. So if you're forced into being one of these soldiers, to become a Janissary is almost like upward mobility for you. And there's all kinds of documentation where you're like, why is this like young boy slave like so proud of his position? Well, because he earned an elite status. Okay, shifting gears again, Japan. During this time period in Japan, we are under what we call the Tokugawa period. This is when the Tokugawa family is the shogunate family. Japan's kind of weird for a long time. Japan only had has had one royal family the entire. There's only one dynasty, the Yamato family. But throughout much of Japanese history, the Yamato family, the emperor, was just a figurehead. So during the shogunates, the emperor just kind of waves at parades and kisses babies kind of thing. They have no real power. The real power is with the shogun. The shogun's the equivalent of like a general. So the shogun, the Tokugawa family, is the shogunate during this era. They are going to be very much isolated from everybody else. They are not interested in trading with the outside world. In fact, only the Dutch are invited in 4 days a year to one specific port. So Japan is going to see themselves as kind of like, yeah, we don't want to deal with anybody else for about a 250-year period. So the shogun, like I said, is the military leader. The emperor is only a figurehead. The kind of lord of the manor, or the guy who owns the castle, this would be a daimyo. These are land-owning aristocrats. This is the nobility. They would then hire samurai. The samurai, we've already talked about samurai a little bit, but the equivalent of a knight. So what had happened, reason for the isolation, I mentioned that before, the isolation. So the reason for this is because you had some missionaries and converts starting to destroy Buddhist shrines. So they kick them all out and expel them. And by the mid-1600s, just about anybody who's foreign is expelled from the country. Foreign books are prohibited. Japanese are not allowed to travel abroad. They're not allowed to build large ships. Basically, they maintain control by isolating themselves. And one of the ways they maintained control over the aristocracy was either the daimyo had to be in the royal city, or if he was going to travel, then his family had to be there in his place. So this kind of works against any kind of rebellion that way, because you threaten your own family's lives. All right, centralizing power in the Mughal Empire. So Akbar, often known as Akbar the Great, is going to really kind of draw the highly learned men into his capital, because he himself is kind of known for being this really fair and just ruler, and all of his subjects could appeal to him for a final ruling. And as his fame for this grew, people who were interested in law and justice were drawn to him and would move to the cities, which leads to an even better system of laws. So one of the positions he creates is this zamindars. These are paid government officials who are in charge of specific duties. So we kind of have this. We have, a deputy director of safety, and their job is safety in the city. Or we have hydrologists. Their job is to study the way the water flows in Broken Arrow, and if there's a problem like flooding, their job is to look at that. So he gives them in payment land grants. Remember, at this time in history, it's not coin that gives you wealth, it's land. Later, these guys are in charge of collecting taxes, and they're allowed to keep a percentage, which leads to a lot of greed and corruption. And really, once Akbar dies, there's not the Zamindars kind of lose their they gain status, but they lose their prestige, if that makes sense. Okay, so rulers are going to legitimize their power through the use of religion and art. A lot of European governments are going to do this, particularly through the idea of divine right. God made me king, so I get to be in control, which is different from mandate of heaven, because the mandate of heaven can be lost. Divine right is something you get just by being born. But a lot of these groups also are going to build these really impressive structures. We've mentioned a few of them already, but we're going to go into a little more detail with them. Okay, so we kind of mentioned Peter the Great and St. Petersburg and all of this kind of earlier, but just want to remind you, the idea is he needs access to a warm water seaport. He chooses the site of St. Petersburg because it allows him to keep an eye on that boyar group that Ivan had trouble with, so it kind of strategically places it. And that winter palace being designed in the European style. It looks kind of like a green and white marble version of the Golden Versailles. That's intentional, because Versailles was seen as like the height of royal power in Europe. So he's going to copy that. So yeah, it looks like Versailles. It doesn't have the onion domes, that Byzantine style that you're used to seeing in Moscow. Shifting gears a little bit to Africa. So Wasika the Great is the leader of the Songhai Africa. He is going to unite his empire using Islam as the official religion and creating a bureaucracy under an Islamic tradition. Guys, when it comes to West Africa, if you draw a blank on a question, if it looks like it's on the trade routes for Saharan Africa, start talking about using Islam as a unifier and building structures in order to show how great their nation is. And you probably got it, whether we're talking Songhai or Mali. Pretty well works. Even the eastern edges, but definitely in the western part of Africa. Okay, probably one of the most famous buildings in the world, the Taj Mahal. Taj Mahal is built by Shah Jahan as a tomb for his wife after she dies, I believe in childbirth. The craftsmanship is unique because it blends both the Islamic elements of calligraphy and ceramic and the balance of it with the local styles of these large, airy structures with geometric designs. So he kind of takes the elements of both, and when you look at it, you can almost quarter this building and see it mirrored on itself. Another example would be the palace, the royal residence of the Ottoman Empire. As you see, this is this huge kind of sprawling series of buildings. But also the Hagia Sophia. I know we talked about this in class the other day. So originally built as a Christian church, Saint Sophia, it gets transformed into a mosque as the Ottomans take over the Byzantine Empire. So you see the traditional, like the domes and the structural build. It does look like a European church. But then you see all these Islamic elements in, obviously the hanging items, but you start to see in the mosaics and things, you see more of an Islamic. So it's this great example. The Hagia Sophia is this beautiful building that kind of blends multiple traditions together. Okay, here's Versailles again. It's used to see an example for legitimizing power and keeping rebellions at bay because you force all of the nobles to live with you at your house where you have lots of spies. Okay, so how are you going to pay for all this? In Russia, excuse me, he tries taxation. After what happens, he tries to industrialize because he tries to force it. You don't have readily resources available. It's hard to become a powerful industry when you don't have iron or not enough of it. So you tax people instead. There's a head tax. You tax based on the head count, which just is not going to work for peasants. They're going to all get sucked into serfdom and indentured servitude. In the Ottoman Empire, and the Mughals too, they're going to use what's called tax farming, where officials and private tax collectors go along, working far from the government eye. That spells corruption. Rebellions are coming. Tax farming, yeah, probably not the way to go if you want to last a long time. In the Ming Dynasty, they have a land tax. Wealthy landowners would collect in their area and not have to pay for themselves. And they would collect, oftentimes in grain, from the peasants, but they would also take silver, salt, wine, goods, free labor. The Chinese and Mexica in the Aztecs, the Songhai, are all going to use tribute as wealth given to them. The reason why Korea is in yellow is because it is not an acceptor, it is a giver of tribute. So this is a sign of respect, a sign of submission, a sign of allegiance. So, but then at the same time, areas like, say, the Aztecs, when an outsider starts to take over, a lot of people who are the tributary area are going to be all for getting rid of the guy who taxes them all the time. So this is to what extent did rulers use taxes to legitimize and consolidate their power in land-based empires? Or to what extent did rulers use monumental architecture to legitimize and consolidate their power? Okay, that's the kind of topical sentences you would see for an LEQ. And I haven't looked at your LEQs yet, but I'm going to start doing that over the weekend, I hope. I'm hoping to get them back to you by Tuesday. Okay, so this statement here, this is kind of a context statement for you. So what's going on? Empires are at this time. So why here at this time in these places? You've got these empires who are recruiting bureaucratic elites and developing military kind of professional roles to help centralize their power. This is going to become more common between rulers who want to control large populations and large amounts of resources. So, for example, China is going to be really big into this bureaucratic system where, say, the Mughals will use it, but not quite to that extent. And a lot of that has to do with how wide does your reach have to be. The farther you have to go mileage-wise, the more you probably use a bureaucracy. So rulers are going to continue to use religion, art, so there's a continuity. Religion, ideas, art, monumental architecture continue to be built. And then new systems, like the tribute system, tax farming, and other systems, are going to help generate new revenues. Do you see how we did what continues and what stays the same there? Also with this, we gave categories, like buckets. So you've got monumental architecture. I didn't really list examples yet. The examples will come in my body paragraphs. But I've given you a category of monumental architecture.